Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll talk about the sources of where we generally collect data and compare the advantages and disadvantages of each. There are no prerequisites for this lesson, so let's begin by defining what those different sources of data are.
Well, there are lots of different sources where we can gather our data. Source data can either come from one or more systems or even from manual observations. So if the data comes from one particular source system, we can either have some direct queries to that system, or there might be some system-generated reports coming out of that system that we can draw from. Manual observations can also be used. It's not always ideal, but they may be necessary, especially if the data that we need is not something already tracked or recorded within a source system. So these three things represent our primary sources that we might draw our data collection from. For the training purposes that we have in all these lessons, the destination eventually for our data will be Minitab as our statistical software we'll use for all of our examples. There are lots of other great software packages that work with statistics, even those that are embedded within Excel. However, for the purpose of this, we're going to use one of the versions of Minitab that has been used for many years and is most widely recognized, but it's certainly not the only one out there. There are a lot of good resources. But in this example, Minitab is going to be your ultimate destination, and that's where it's going to go after we first configure the data within Excel. Excel is going to be our example where we're trying to build our data set, collect the data set, and massage it. And it doesn't even have to be Excel. It could be in another tool like Access or even something else that's not necessarily Microsoft based. But because Excel is a widely available and common tool in many businesses, we'll use that as a primary example for where we might configure our data to prepare it for data analysis. And then from there, we'll export that data and use that data within Minitab, where we'll be beginning the statistical analysis itself.
Now let's compare the advantages and disadvantages between the three different sources of data.
Well, again, the different source systems that we refer to where we might collect our data is going to be the source system or maybe multiple systems itself where we're collecting the data, or from system reports that are coming from that source system, or maybe some manual observation where we're tracking that data manually. Well, let's do some comparisons between these different sources and talk about the differences between them. So for example, can you get the data quickly? Well, usually from a source system, you usually can, but it might require some additional expertise for someone to actually know how to pull the data from the system or getting access to the data directly from the system. So usually, if you've got a good resource, you might be able to get that data quickly. From our system report, generally it's going to be a lot faster because it's something that's already pre-configured and designed and canned, so that way the report is already generated for us, and it's usually going to be a very good, quick resource for us. Manual observation, though, it's not going to be that quick at all. It's going to take a lot of time to be able to plan for how you're going to collect the data, to actually set up for the data collection, and even go through some of the rigor of ensuring you can trust the data that you're collecting, such as if you're wanting to do what we're going to talk about in a later lesson, the measurement system analysis, to make sure we can trust that collected data. Now, from the detail level of the data, the source system is probably going to be the most detailed. Usually in the source systems it's going to have a lot of information, but the system report is usually going to be summarized. So it's not going to have necessarily a level of detail that we might need in order to do some statistical analysis. Manual observation, though, can be detailed. It doesn't always have to be, but generally when we're collecting that data manually, it's going to be detailed, although we might end up summarizing it or rolling it up to some higher level if we needed to. But usually the source system and manual observation is going to be the most detailed type of data we collect. Consistency for the data for the source system, yes, it's going to generally be consistent in how the data is stored and collected and how it was planned for storing that data in the system. Same thing for the system report. Since it's coming from that source system and that source system is intended, or we assume that it's going to be consistent, then we would also presume that the system reports from that source system are going to be consistent as well. Manual observation, that's not always going to be consistent. Again, this is where we have to go back to the rigor of applying a measurement system analysis, or MSA, to ensure that we can trust the accuracy, reliability, reproducibility, and repeatability of the data as we're collecting it. Is historical data available? Usually it is for source system. You can go back. Sometimes they have to archive some of the data depending on how far you have to go back historically. But for the most part, that type of data that's recorded in the source system is going to be historical. You should have access to that. Same thing for the system reports. Usually, depending again on the process for storing these reports and archiving them, it's usually going to be available. So that both of those resources should be helpful if we need to go back to collect the historical data. For manual observation, no, we can't get anything historical. It's going to be from the point of when we're actually doing the manual observation, so we're not going to have any historical data for that. Now, is the data easy to get? That is, does it require any unique expertise? It's not necessarily going to be that easy from a source system. As I mentioned before, you might require some specific expertise or accesses to get to the system in order to be able to query the data that you need. So in some ways, it may not be so easy. But if you're in the position where you already have access to that source data and you're already familiar with maybe some coding like SQL in order to pull it, then that might be really easy for you. But for the most part, for most people, that may not always be available, so it may not be the easiest resource to get information. But the system reports are going to generally be a lot easier. It's something, again, that somebody had produced from the source system, so usually it's going to be a lot easier to obtain system reports or outputs from the source system than to do a query, a customized query from the source system itself. For manual observation, yes, it's generally going to be easy to get in the sense of when you're doing the data collection and observation yourself and recording it, it's not going to be difficult. It may not require a high level of expertise to actually do the recording. Now, that's not to say anything about the reliability of the data that you're collecting or any of the other elements we talked about and the other characteristics. But as far as the ease of recording the data and collecting it like that, generally it's going to be easy as well for the manual observation. Is the data customizable? Probably for a source system, you probably can make it customizable depending on the complexity and the level of access that you have to the source system. So in that way, you might have that option of making it customizable. For system reports, for the most part, it's not going to be customizable. Unless they allow for some specific filtering that you can do in the system report, then it might be possible. But for the most part, it's going to be a lot less customizable compared to doing some SQL coding directly to the source system. For manual observation, it's absolutely going to be customizable because you're having to start from scratch and doing the data collection. So you just design and collect the data in the way that you want, so it's very customizable. Now, is the data generally accepted as reliable? From a source system, it usually will be considered to be reliable because usually there was some rigor that was applied up front before the system was developed or as it was being developed to ensure that it was accurate and reliable. So generally you can trust some of the data that's coming from the source system because it is relatively consistent and has already gone through some of that rigor to ensure it's accurate. Same thing for the system reports. For the most part, at that level, you can trust that it's going to be reliable, again, because it's a systemic process that's followed that generally is going to be consistent. So in that way, we can presume that it also is going to be reliable. At least both of these methods will usually be more reliable than a manual observation. Depending on the rigor that you apply to the manual observation, again, it for the most part is more susceptible to having errors and therefore again requires the rigor of a measurement system analysis or MSA to ensure that we can trust the accuracy, repeatability, and reproducibility of the data that's collected through manual observations. So based off all these different characteristics behind each of these different methods or sources of where you can collect your data, I'd recommend first of all, if you can, go to the source system. It's going to be the most consistent, comprehensive, and generally it's going to be the most reliable, at least by all the subject matter experts or SMEs. That's usually going to be your best starting point for collecting all the data that you need. But if you can't get that, then the next best source might be to rely on some of the system reports coming out of the system that other people have produced for you. Again, it's going to be fast, it should be consistent and considered to be reliable, but again, it may not be customizable or may not provide exactly what you need or enough detail for what you need for analysis. But it, for the most part, can be at least a better option than this last option, which is a manual observation. If you cannot get the data already pre-recorded in these other methods, then manual observation may be necessary, especially if it's a critical measurement for your Y that you're measuring and you don't have any data collection around that particular Y, then you might find yourself that you have to go through some manual observation process for tracking that data. And it's going to involve some smaller samples. It's generally going to be less consistent and it may not be as reliable, repeatable, or reproducible in the method for collecting that data. So as a last resort, then I would recommend following the manual observation. But whatever the data resource is that you're using, you should make sure that you balance that resource with the analysis risks versus rewards. Again, back to the issue of time versus accuracy. Again, we need to consider if the more important issue is to get something faster, then we might need to draw from our source system or system reports. However, if the more important issue is to get accuracy and we don't necessarily have the data available in the source system or we can't get it so fast and ensure that it's accurate, then again we might find ourselves leaning toward that manual observation method as our primary resource for collecting data.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
What I'd like you to do is think of at least 3 prior situations that you've worked on where you had to do some data collection. For each of those situations, try to ask yourself these few questions. First of all, what was the source for the collected data? Did you draw it directly from a source system, or was it from a system report output from the system? Or was it through a manual observation, or maybe even some other method that we hadn't discussed? And why was that particular source used for your data collection? Why did you choose that particular source as your basis for your analysis that you were doing? And what are some of the disadvantages, if there were any, by using the particular data source that you had used? Now, if you didn't have an issue about time, if time were luxury and you didn't have to worry about getting a fast answer, then what would have been the most ideal source of data for you to use in that particular situation?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.